Welcome back. This is the third and final part of my analysis of the Let It Be and Get Back documentaries. So now it's Sunday the 26th of January. This is the beginning of the third episode. And we are told the Beatles have been rehearsing for 16 days for a live album and possibly to stage some kind of a show. They have to be finished by the end of the month. Again, why? Why are these self-imposed deadlines being made when they know they can't meet them? The latest plan is to perform on the rooftop of their own building 3 days from now. Here we are on Sunday the 26th of January, and Ringo is working on a little tune of his, which is Octopus's Garden, and immediately George Harrison jumps in to help him, because he knows better than anybody else in the world how hard it is to get a song on a Beatles album that isn't by Paul, i.e. Billy, and John. Because every Beatles album is the Paul and John show, or the Billy and John show, really. In this moment, we get a little insight into how George Harrison thinks when he's writing music. First of all, he recognizes, just by hearing it, the A minor chord that Ringo is playing. Then he demonstrates a suggestion of a chord progression with an improvised melody over the top that Ringo might use. And he says it's important that at the end, you come back round to the chord that you were on at the beginning so that it resolves. All of this is really interesting because it's an insight into what George knew in practical terms about how to write music. He may not be classically trained, but he is in this moment demonstrating some fundamental understanding of how music works. Let me be really clear about what I mean here. I believe that at the beginning, when the Beatles first signed to EMI, that they had the majority, if not all, of their songs written for them as a group. But gradually, by the time we get to the end of the 60s as a decade, they were expected to write the majority of their own songs. They probably had some outside help from someone like George Martin, and obviously from Billy Shears, but basically I think they were working out those songs between them as a band. This might explain why different periods within the Beatles' career produced songs that sounded like they were written by different people. So anyway, everyone's playing nicely together, and then Billy turns up with Linda and his soon-to-be adoptive daughter, Heather. And Heather is a very sweet child, but you can't help but think that it was a mistake to bring a child into a working environment because she's surrounded by adults who just want to play with her and entertain her. And in a sense, in this moment, she becomes more disruptive to the group than Yoko was. I understand why Billy has brought Linda and Heather in, because he didn't want to work on the Sunday. He wanted to have a day off where he could relax and be with his, new family, essentially. But they are behind and they're trying to make up time, so it seems like a mistake to bring outsiders in on this day. So whilst they're working on Long and Winding Road, Billy is giving very precise directions to Ringo about how he should be playing the drums, and he gets more and more and more fed up because Billy has apparently learnt nothing from George leaving the group and then having to coax him back. Then there's more jamming, more mucking about, Yoko and Heather wailing on the tape. They even play Long and Winding Road in a sort of comic Latin American ballroom style, like a sort of begin. Of course, they inevitably play rock and roll tunes to cheer themselves up, and we even see people lying around on the ground. I mean, what are they doing? They've got a deadline to meet. Eventually, Ringo switches off altogether, and Billy says, yeah, there wouldn't be much drumming there, would there? In a sort of slightly sarcastic way, I think. They are still working on Long and Winding Road. George Martin comes into the studio and goes over to George Harrison and says, you're playing the wrong chords. We need to sort something out here. And George Harrison says, I can't really hear. That's why I'm playing the wrong chords. Because they haven't sorted out their PA. He can't hear his own playing over the sound of everybody else. Because they still haven't sorted out the studio properly. The 26th of January. And they still haven't sorted out the studio properly, so that when they do something acoustic, whoever's playing acoustically can actually hear themselves playing. So we're told that this performance of Long and Winding Road is the one that appears on the album. But this is not the version on the album. The version on the album, at least the one from 1970, was recorded on the 31st of January, so I don't know what they mean here. Are they saying that they're using the audio from that recording and they've placed it here on the 26th of January over this performance? Or are they admitting that the original recording is a composite? I don't know, but all I'm saying is there's a discrepancy here. They say in the documentary that Long and Winding Road was recorded on the 26th of January, but the official record says that it wasn't recorded until the 31st. Who is wrong, who's right, I don't know, but there's a discrepancy. Then they start to work on Old Brown Shoe, and George is at the piano and he plays a chord, and he says, oh, this is E with a C. And he calls over to Billy Preston and says, Billy, what's this chord? And Billy doesn't know. And I was really surprised. He knew other chords that he asked about, F sharp diminished, but he didn't know E with a C. And E with a C is not E with a C, it's E with a B sharp. He's actually playing E, G sharp, B sharp, which is E augmented. C and B sharp being inharmonically the same thing. It's the same physical key on a piano. I was very surprised that Billy Preston didn't know that. Perhaps more importantly, when George calls over to Billy Preston, the camera immediately pans to Billy Shears, thus giving the audience a subtle clue that Billy isn't Paul. More mucking about takes place. They do get other things done. They do play through Let It Be, Long and Winding Road, Oh Darling, Don't Let Me Down, Get Back, Old Brown Shoe, but none of them are finished. And they end up with a lot of unusable takes. And eventually Glyn tells them over the foldback, you do realise this tape is costing you 2 shillings a foot? To which George replies, costing EMI, I think you'll find. We're EMI artists, aren't we? And this demonstrates his, probably all of the Beatles, lack of business acumen. Because I've never looked at the Beatles' contract, but most probably it would be like any other contract. The record label gives you an advance payment, which is essentially a massive loan. Out of that, you make your album, you pay everybody involved in its production, and then you have to pay the original advance payment back to the record company. And then, finally, as an artist, your record sales will start earning you money. So all of this is costing the Beatles a lot of money, whether or not they realise it yet. Just an interesting aside that when they are re-recording Get Back again, we get this interesting little picture through the window to the control room. Alan Parsons was the tape op when they were trying to record Get Back. They have a little meeting about what they're actually trying to achieve. And the Beatles, mostly Billy, want to try to get at least 3 songs played at a time, one after the other, so that everything segues into each other, so it has more of a live sound. But they can't manage it. Very rarely do they ever get past the first song before they make a mistake. So much for the super band. George Martin says to them, well, you can always edit. And they're very offended by this. But the reality is, it's the 27th of January. This project should have already finished. And they haven't actually really got very much recorded at this point. And they make their protestations to George, and he says, right, so we do it again, and then we do it again, and then we do it again. He's mocking them slightly, but with absolutely every good reason. They're trying to get Back, Don't Let Me Down, and I Got a Feeling recorded one after the other. But they very rarely even get through Get Back, never mind the other two. As I said, the Beatles are very resistant to the idea of editing, as George Martin suggests, but that's what they end up doing anyway. They just don't tell us in the documentary, which is, I feel, quite misleading. We are told, however, that this performance of Get Back from the 27th of January is the one that appears on the album, but official history says that it's actually recorded on the 28th of January. So I don't know if this is a lie or an error, or actually it turns out that Get Back was recorded on the 27th and not the 28th of January. But whatever it is a discrepancy with the official credits on this song. Tuesday the 28th of January. The rooftop concert is supposed to be tomorrow, but it's moved to the 30th due to poor weather. And in the meantime, they're still trying to work out what they're going to play up there. So it's good to know that they're, even at this late stage, bearing in mind they should have been playing the next day, they still don't know what they're playing. So then they go on to work on George's song, Something. They play a bluesy version of Love Me Do, but they don't even play that all the way through, and they don't play it properly, which is kind of a shame because I actually really prefer it to the original. Billy then goes off to a secret meeting at lunchtime. The rest of the band play I Have a Feeling without him. Then they open some wine, and we get this close-up of the year of its vintage, and it's 1966, which of course is the year that Paul was killed. Remember, boys and girls, that there was 10 hours of footage left out of the original edit of this film, but they kept that in, which means it's significant. And then they start to talk about Alan Klein, who John has seen the night before, and they actually go and meet him later on that day for the first time as a group. Whilst they're working on Old Brown Shoe again, George talks to Mel and says, is there a really good shoe shop nearby on Bond Street? And can you convince someone to come by with a selection of black slip-on size 8s? Because I never get out to shoe shops. And I thought, 8? A UK size 8? For a man that's meant to be 5'10.5", 5'11". British men in the audience, please correct me if you feel that that's wrong, but that seems slightly small to me. Maybe he just has small feet, I don't know, but that seems odd for a man of that height. If indeed he really was that height. My brother is 5'8" and he has size 8 feet. George Martin comes in and says that they need to retune. And John jumps up and makes a quip that, I've had some wine, you know, remember Bob Wooler? I mean, they all laugh because they know it's a joke, but it's interesting that that reference is not explained to the audience. Many other sort of slightly obscure references are explained to the audience, but they don't explain this one because, if you don't know, Bob Wooler, who was a DJ that used to introduce them at clubs in Liverpool, in fact, he was the person to first put the band into the order of John, Paul, George and Ringo, or at least he's accredited with that. One time at the real Paul McCartney's 31st birthday party, and they were all drunk, Bob Wooler made a suggestion to John Lennon that because John had gone to Spain with Brian Epstein, that maybe he was a closet homosexual. John did not take kindly to this, and he beat the hell out of him. And Bob Wooler was taken for emergency medical treatment, and the rumour goes that he was also paid off to keep him quiet, although eventually they did make up. None of that's mentioned because obviously nobody wants to mention that that's the sort of person that John was. If you've ever read May Pang's book, you'll know that she confirms this. John was a perfectly nice man when he was sober, but he could not handle his drink, and he particularly couldn't handle wine. And there are several occasions when he was with May Pang that he trashed the place when he was drunk. Absolutely lost his mind. And he would do thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of pounds worth of damage whilst drunk. And then in the morning, he wouldn't even remember doing it until he was shown the devastation of what he'd done. Because it's all part of the mythology, you see. The Beatles are perfect, and you're not meant to know that they're actually just human, with flaws that are not very attractive. On the 28th of January, the official narrative says that the single of Get Back was recorded, and that also the B-side Don't Let Me Down was recorded on the same day. We're told during the recording of Don't Let Me Down in the documentary that this take was chosen as the B-side for the next single. It's kind of odd, because in the Get Back documentary, they say that they recorded Get Back on the 27th of January, which is the day before. Maybe they did, I don't know. The problem is that it doesn't match up with the narrative that these songs were played live on the rooftop. So they're almost like they're trying to have their cake and to eat it. It's either these things were recorded in a studio or they were recorded on a rooftop, which is the pretense of the album. By that I mean both the original 1970 version and later reworked versions. So after that they play a version of I Want You, She's So Heavy. And then Billy launches into Half a Pound of Grease Paint, which is another little bonzo-like ditty. And it's a whole song. It's not just a little improv piece. It's a whole song. And I wonder where it came from, because you don't conjure a whole song up like that with fully worked out lyrics. It's accredited to Lennon and McCartney, but it sounds like the sort of thing that Billy did when he was with the Bonzos. A sort of Cockney music hall song. Now we're on to Wednesday the 29th of January, steadily getting to the end of the month. And then we have this really curious little conversation. They're still trying to decide on what they're playing for this concert that is the next day. Billy still wants to do 14 songs in a row, all live, but it's obviously not going to happen. He's trying to convince the group otherwise, but they won't back down because it's totally unrealistic. And he says, we see, it's like when we came back from Hamburg and did Leicester de Montfort Hall. We had the worst first night thing. And he then goes on to say how, once they got over the nerves of playing live again, it would be fine, using this reference from their touring days to illustrate his point. But the problem is, I have no idea what he's talking about. The last time the Beatles played Hamburg was the Christmas New Year period of 1962. Then they came back and played Scotland for a week. Then they went back to Liverpool. They played the Cavern. They played various other venues. And then on the 31st of March 1963, so almost 3 months after they came back from Hamburg, then they played Leicester de Montfort Hall. Why would they be nervous playing there if they've been playing almost every day in between for 3 months? Unless there's some other event at Leicester de Montfort Hall that I don't know about, Billy's just making stuff up here. And I don't know how John managed to keep a straight face. I mean, they did play Leicester de Montfort Hall 2 other occasions. One, I think, was in the December of 63, and the other was in the October of 64. But they have absolutely no bearing on anything they might have done in Hamburg, because it would have been such a long time in the past for them. So none of this makes sense to me. They carry on having this meeting. Billy wants 6 more weeks to get the 14 songs played together live. George comments that it would take many more weeks than that to do what he wants to do, and basically that he can't stand it any longer. John says, yeah, it's disappointing, we've only got 7, but let's just do the 7. i.e. let's play the 7 live on the roof. At this impromptu meeting, they realise they don't actually have very much recorded that could actually be released as well. This validates everything I've said about the fragments of recordings that have been played up until this point in the Get Back documentary. The audience has never seen any whole performances, and in this moment, we see that this is because, despite all of the many takes, they either made incomplete recordings or ones that were complete but not good enough to use for commercial release. And even the other members of the band, especially George, are surprised by this. This might be in some small way because they're used to making composite recordings, which would be the normal practice. You don't normally play something over and over until the entire piece is perfect. You'd normally go back in, punch in the bit that wasn't quite right, or if you have 2 takes and the beginning of one is really good and the end of the other one is better, then you just composite them together. And what they're trying to do is quite unusual. And it also makes quite a mockery of their debut album, which was meant to be entirely live in studio. Somehow, even though they were novices in the studio, they managed to record 10 tracks in one day. And now they can't manage to record 7 tracks in a month. And then we get this interesting conversation between Billy and Glyn. Glyn says, well, once you've done this recording on the rooftop with the 7 songs they have got by this point, after you've recorded it, why don't you rethink the TV show? Because especially if it's only half an hour long, they could probably figure out something. And then Billy turns to him and says, see, the thing is, this TV show was supposed to be a TV show of the last album. But when we came to do it, we said, we'll write new songs. Now, I never knew that. And it's the only time it's mentioned. What he means is that the TV show was meant to be of the production of the White Album, not of Let It Be. And they've said they'll write new songs, but they didn't have to. Not on camera. They could have gone away and thought about it. This whole project really does seem like a self-imposed piece of torture. I really don't know why they even said yes to it. Then Billy talks about not being supported again, and he says, we need to sort of get something together, or else I feel like I'm trying to produce the Beatles and no one can do it. Because of course he is trying to produce the Beatles. Then Billy says, do we even have a list of what we could play? Not just for the rooftop, but on the album. And George Martin offers him a list of everything that they've noted down, everything they've attempted to record so far. And Billy reads the list. And it includes I Got a Feeling, Don't Let Me Down, Get Back. Unlike a Love That's Right, this is the working title for Old Brown Shoe. Long and Winding Road, Let It Be, For You Blue. Two of Us, All I Want Is You. Across the Universe, Maxwell's Silver Hammer. 1 After 909. She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, Teddy Boy. All Things Must Pass. And Dig It. You'll note that Billy says that's Lucky 13. But very few of them are actually finished. And even if they are finished, they're not rehearsed. Also note that I Me Mine is not included in that list. Anyway, after he reads the list, George Martin says, well, there's no question we've got an album. And Billy says, it's like all those new ones that we've got to do to make up the number. They don't exist. This is a serious retconning of history. This documentary so far has shown that none of this stuff is finished. And yet they're trying to claim at this point that all of these songs are ready to go, that they could be played live, that they could be recorded. But so far, we've not seen them actually play most of these songs all the way through once. "We've got 'em all," says Billy, but do they? Because they haven't shown us. What they actually have, I think, is a lot of potential. They have a lot of ideas, which eventually will be fleshed out and completed. But the point is, they're not finished in this moment. And bear in mind the conversation that they've just had. They've just said, despite all the days they've spent in the studio and all the many, many takes they've made, they don't have anything actually finished and ready to be put out commercially apart from the Get Back single. Let's take stock. Here's a list of all the songs just read out by Billy. On the right-hand side of the screen, I've also included the name of the album or single that they were eventually destined to appear on. I've added I, Me, Mine and Maggie May to the bottom of the list because they were on the Let It Be album but left off the list read out by Billy. If the songs are finished and rehearsed, then there's no reason why they shouldn't have been able to record them by the 29th of January, when Billy claims that we've got them all. They are going to play these songs live on a rooftop to all of central London the next day. So if they can do that, then I think it's fair to expect that the songs should have been recorded by the end of the 29th of January. It is true to say that some of these songs needed to have been recorded in a studio rather than a rooftop, either because they were quiet acoustic numbers or they needed the grand piano. But for most of these songs, it should have been possible to have played them on the roof, and the reality is, they weren't played on the roof. So let's look at that list again. Let's look at the songs that were recorded in their final form by the 29th of January. Here we have the same list, but now the songs that were recorded by that day are highlighted in red. They include the Get Back single and its B-side, Don't Let Me Down, For You Blue, although its vocal was actually re-recorded a year later, and the largely improvised songs Dig It and Maggie May. Everything else was recorded later. Yes, I know they were going to record them as a live album, ideally on the rooftop of their building. But of the 12 tracks on the 1970 Let It Be album, only 3 of them were actually recorded on the roof. And I don't believe that they didn't need at least some additional post-concert editing and redubbing. It's obvious from the footage in the Get Back documentary that most of these songs were either not finished or not rehearsed before the rooftop concert, and it's a deception to say otherwise. Billy goes off to lunch with his brother Mike, and George and John are still in the studio. And George says to John, "See, the thing is, I've got my quota of tunes for the next 10 years or 10 albums. And I'd like to get this backlog of songs recorded. And it would be a really good idea to just record them down and have an outlet. And then that would preserve this Beatle bit. In fact, it would be really good if all of us could record a solo album and then still come back and record an album together as the Beatles." This is an excellent point, and I don't know why they didn't do that, and perhaps they might not have broken up quite so soon. Also, it's worth noting that when they are trying to come up with a list of songs to play on the rooftop, George pipes up with, "I've got 14 of my own songs we could play for an hour," and no one's listening to him. He's completely ignored. Anyway, that's the end of that day, and the big day comes. Thursday, the 30th of January, the day of the rooftop concert, and this is a shot from across the road. And we are told in the basement studio, George and Glyn are ready to record the rooftop performance. First of all, what's Glyn even doing there, because he was meant to be in a studio in LA? But that aside, I have some real reservations about this. Firstly, how did they manage to get many hundreds of feet worth of cabling vertically through a building without the cables being broken, without them being stepped on? They're in the basement. The roof is 4 stories above. How did they get hundreds of feet of cable vertically through the building and out to the rooftop? Where did they get cable that long in the first place? But having gotten it, if they did indeed get it, how did they manage to get it vertically through the building without it being broken, without someone stepping on it, without it getting jammed in a doorway, without it being yanked? Once you've got a length of cable that long, particularly guitar cables, because they tend to be unbalanced and unshielded, particularly back in 1969, how did they not have any problems with the cable, even if it wasn't broken? I mean, you'd expect maybe line hum or interference from the other recording equipment on the roof, because they've got 10 cameras. And once you've got really long lengths of cabling, you introduce the idea of signal degradation. I mean, there's all sorts of problems that might have occurred. Why did they think it was a good idea to record from the rooftop to the basement? And how did they manage it? Did they manage it? Or is this another piece of the deception? I don't know, but it seems really odd to me. But anyway, the live show happens, and on the album, I've got a feeling One After 909 and Dig a Pony are the only tracks that are actually taken from this rooftop concert and put on the album. There's 12 tracks on the album, so not 14. 2 of them are improvised filler from the studio, so that leaves us with 10. But out of the whole 12 tracks, only 3 of them are actually supposedly live. We're not entirely sure if they are live either. When they play I've Got a Feeling for the second time on the roof, we hear them playing the guitar, but visually, at the beginning of that recording, you don't see them playing what you hear them playing. So that's kind of odd. Also, the official narrative says that the engineers went to M&S to buy ladies' stockings as additional protection from the microphones, as well as using windshields, but I'm not sure how much difference stockings over the microphones would make. I don't know why you can't hear the wind, and you can't hear London. Even if they were using highly directional pickup patterns on the microphones that only took sound from immediately in front of the mic, because you can hear the wind, and you can hear sirens, and you can hear London on the Nagra tapes, even from the shotgun mic. So I don't know what kind of difference that would have made either. And then we get a bit where I think they probably tell us what's actually going on. The police turn up because there's been all these complaints about the noise. And one of the policemen in the reception of the Apple building says the obvious. If you're doing the picture, I'm sure you can dub the sound onto the film, can't you? Maybe they just told us what they're actually doing in this documentary, and probably the original documentary. So they go up to the roof, they talk to Mal, and Mal says he will turn the PA off so that the sound of their playing won't carry. But of course, if they turn their PAs off, then George and John can't actually hear their own playing. They stop playing. In the original Let It Be documentary, when they stop playing, you don't hear the fact that they've stopped playing. In the Get Back documentary, you do hear that they've stopped playing. So that's at least an improvement on honesty. It's interesting to note that Billy never has his PA turned off, even though he's closest to the door when the police arrive, and bass waves travel furthest because they're longer. If the police were really interested in a disturbance of the peace, one would think that the 2 things they'd want to stop the most are the bass and the drumming. If you'd like a bit of homework, and you have a copy of Anthology 3, look up that version of Get Back, because that version of that song is the recording taken from the rooftop concert, and I think the only reason it was included is because of its historical worth. The thing you'll note is how rough it sounds. It's a pretty ropey recording in every sense of the word, not just because the playing is disrupted by George and John having their PA turned off, but the whole thing. You can hear the wind, you can hear London, you can hear all the things you expect to hear in a recording made on a windy rooftop in the middle of winter in one of the busiest cities in the world. But you don't hear that in the Get Back documentary or the Let It Be documentary. In fact, you only hear the ambient sounds when they're not playing a song. As soon as they start to play a song, it's literally like those sounds have been turned off. It's so bizarre. It just makes me really suspicious that nothing is actually live. Or maybe that they pre-recorded the tracks and they were miming. Or maybe they pre-recorded them and they were singing over them. Or something. Also, if you listen to the single version of Get Back on Past Masters, you can hear that one's very clearly in a studio. And yet on the album, it's the same take. The only difference between the single version and the album version is that the album version is slightly edited, so it's kind of shorter, but then they graft on a couple of vocal ad-libs from the rooftop performance, and they crossfade them in at the beginning and the end to give the impression that it was one take and that it was recorded live on the roof, but it wasn't. So they come down from the roof after the police have turned up, even though you never actually see the police move them on, which is interesting. You don't see it in the Get Back documentary and you don't see it in Let It Be either, because that's where it actually ends. The Let It Be documentary just sort of suddenly ends once the police turn up on the roof. In the Get Back documentary, once they get down from the roof, I think George basically says the quiet bit out loud. If we've got the police, i.e. on film, we could pretend in the film that we had to get down because of them. And here we are. To which John replies, "Oh, just the way it happened then." But that's not how it happened. The reality is they only ever had 7 tracks to perform when they should have had 14. And even given that some of them were deliberately recorded in a studio because they needed the piano, they still didn't have enough material to play a live concert. There's no getting away from that fact. And I think George just said the quiet bit out loud here. We're told on screen it takes a while to bring all the equipment down from the roof. Presumably it took a while to get it up there too. So they decide to come back tomorrow to complete the final recordings. And that gives the impression that the album is finished on the next day, but it isn't. The album is not finished for another year. And we're never told that. So that's very misleading. Friday the 31st of January, this is the last day of recording at Apple. We get a performance of The Two of Us, which is, as we're told on screen, the performance that is on the Let It Be album. This is apparently true. We also should have had a performance of Long and Winding Road. That was also recorded on this day, but they only show it over the end credits in the Get Back documentary. They finally get to a whole performance of this song, and they decide to run it over the end credits, which is absolutely incredible. We're also told that Let It Be is recorded on the 31st of January. That's not true. The official record says that Let It Be was re-recorded on the 4th of January 1970, so almost a whole year later. So let's have a look at the track listing for the Let It Be album. The parts I've highlighted in red are the tracks that still need at least some re-recording after the 31st of January 1969. So there's still maybe a quarter of the album, not recorded yet, and that includes Let It Be, which is the title track. And in fact, the Get Back documentary doesn't really have an ending. It simply ends with the Beatles recording Let It Be over and over and over again, and then eventually fades to black, which I think says it all. So the Get Back project just fizzled out, and it was put on a shelf while the Beatles got on with other projects, including the production of the much better album Abbey Road. The original brief for the Get Back project was crazy, and they should never have signed up to it. Any band would have struggled to have written 14 songs in a fortnight, rehearse them, and play them live to an audience, and then to have those shows recorded and put out as a film, an album, and the rehearsal footage edited together as a documentary. The Beatles should never have agreed to it in the first place. Maybe they just believed in their own myth. As for the two documentaries of this time in history, what are we to make of them? Is one more honest than the other? I think it's hard to say. One version is more complete by virtue of being longer, and that could be said to be more honest, but really, any time we edit, we change the narrative. The only way to be truly honest is to release all the footage and audio from that deep underground vault that Peter Jackson visited, and let the public, and nerds like me, see what really happened. And that is the end of my analysis of Let It Be and Get Back. Thank you ever so much for watching all the way through to the end, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.